Good morning and welcome to my channel. If you're new, we're glad to have you, and if you've been here before, then you know that my channel is mostly cooking and sewing projects with a few craft projects sprinkled in. Today I had a few sketchy apples that I needed to find something to do with, and I've been wanting to make or try apple fritters for a long time. So right now I am just taking 3 apples and cutting them up, peeling them, and then dicing them into small pieces. The recipe called for 2 apples, and I think by the time I cut out all the bad spots, that's what I had. You can see this one is really bad. But there was a little bit that was perfectly fine, so that's what I used. These are Honeycrisp apples that I'm using. The recipe calls for 2 large Granny Smith or Honeycrisp apples, peeled, cored, and diced. Now to make the batter, and into a large bowl, I am adding 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour. Then I'm adding 1/4 cup of white granulated sugar, 2 teaspoons of baking powder. I had just a little bit left in that first container that I just emptied into the bowl. Since I am not using eggs with this, I'm going to try it without eggs. I am adding another teaspoon of baking powder for my egg substitute. 1/2 teaspoon of salt, 1.5 teaspoons of ground cinnamon. The recipe had said to mix the flour, sugar, baking powder, salt, and cinnamon all together in the bowl, and then make a well in the center and add the liquid ingredients, which are milk, eggs, and applesauce, and then stir to combine. But I just dumped everything together. I didn't read the recipe before I started. And right now I am adding the rest of the ingredients for my egg substitute just to one side of the bowl. And I added 2 tablespoons of oil, vegetable oil, and 4 tablespoons of water. You can see I'm in the middle of emptying my dishwasher as I'm cooking and doing this. I'm not the most prepared cook when it comes to projects. I have one of those little snack size packages of applesauce, and so now I am just going to add 3 tablespoons of applesauce to the side with my wet ingredients. If you were going to use eggs, you would put in 2 eggs at this time, and don't put in the extra baking powder or oil or water. I will have the recipe written out in the description box, so follow that if you're getting confused. And to that, I'm adding 1/3 of a cup of milk, and I'm too lazy to go get my wet measuring cup, and so I just use the dry 1/3 cup measure. Then mix it together well. After you do that, then fold the apples into the batter. When I started mixing the batter together, I started heating up oil into my skillet on the stove, just on a medium heat. You don't want to start a grease fire, so don't put it on high. And be sure to watch it closely. I'm just putting the wooden spoon in to see if bubbles come around it. And if they do, then your oil is probably hot enough. However, I found out later that mine wasn't hot enough. You want it to be at 375 degrees Fahrenheit. And so it would be a really good idea if you had a thermometer that you can put in oil to use that for this recipe. So I am just putting about 1/4 of a cup of batter into the hot oil, and you try and spread that as flat as you can. These first ones that I tried, I thought that the recipe was a fail because they were falling apart. I couldn't turn them over without them falling apart. And so I thought a couple of things were wrong. And I thought, well, maybe I've made my apples too big. Maybe I needed to cut my apples more finely as I stirred it into the batter, it needed to be more fine. I also thought that maybe not adding the eggs to the mixture was the reason that they were not holding together. But after I did a few, I realized that the first ones, my oil just was not hot enough. And so they were falling apart before they could hold together with the heat of the oil. You're going to want to cook these 2 minutes per side. And so you can see as I'm trying to, I think that they are brown enough, so I'm trying to flip them over, and I got a spoon to help me with it because they were just floppy and wanting to fall apart. So that's when I thought that maybe my apples were too chunky and that they should be more finely chopped. And this one completely disintegrates and falls apart. But that was okay. We had them like you would have donut holes. So don't be discouraged. This is kind of like making pancakes, and you know how the first one never turns out nice. And I just think that apple fritters are just a little more tricky than a regular fried donut. But they're not hard once you get over the scariness of doing that first batch. So I'm ready to pull these out of the oil now. And one of them was super crunchy because it fried for such a long time. This big one, I think, was the one that was just really, really crunchy. Too crunchy almost. And so I'm just putting these on a plate with paper toweling on it so that the grease can absorb into the toweling, the paper towels. This next group of 3 turned out much better. And like I said before, I think it was because my oil was hotter, and I actually turned it down a little bit because it was getting too brown too fast. But and I made them a little bit smaller. That one that I made bigger on the first fry was difficult to turn. So I made them a little bit smaller, and they fried up really nicely. And I don't think that it made a difference that I had used baking powder, oil, and water instead of the eggs. So that makes for a good alternative if you have vegans in your family or those who are allergic to eggs. And I guess if you are making these for someone who is vegan, you can swap out the milk for a substitute like oat milk or almond milk or rice milk. I've not tried a milk substitute in these, but I don't know why it wouldn't work. It should work. Be careful as you're turning these, since you're working with hot oil, so that you don't plop the donut into the hot oil and it splashes up on you. It's also probably a good idea to have little children and animals out of the kitchen as you're frying these fritters. So these turned out much better. They're not falling apart. They turned over nicely, and they fried up really quickly. And so I am just putting them onto the plate with paper towels, and you can see how nice and brown they came out and have just the right amount of crunch on them. My husband came home while I was frying these, and before he saw what I was doing, he asked if I was making apple pie because the house smelled like apples. I'm making a simple glaze for these, and it is just 2 cups of powdered sugar, a 1/4 cup of milk, and a 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla. However, I made this up and it was not enough for the batch that I made. And it could be that my fritters were smaller and so I needed more glaze, or I didn't drain the glaze off of the fritter well enough. But just be prepared that you may need to make more glaze for this than this recipe. So this was the fun part. And I took a baking sheet and put a piece of parchment paper on top of it and a wire rack, cookie rack on top of that. And I am just dipping the fritters into the glaze, letting it run off. You dip both sides and then putting it on the rack to drain and dry. And these are still hot as I'm doing this. You can see I lost one of the rubber things off of my tongs as I was frying the donuts up, the fritters up. And I just never put it back on. I have a larger set of tongs, but I like these with the rubber mitts on them. And then there's a tiny little one, like a munchkin or a donut hole. And I really like the little ones. My husband thought that these were delicious, but kind of sweet. And so if you don't like really sweet stuff, you may want to just dip it on one side. I don't know if making the glaze thinner would help with that, or if it would dry if you made it thinner. So I don't know how to fix that problem except to just dip one side. If you would even consider that a problem. My son-in-law tried one of these and he liked them. He didn't say that they were too sweet. So there you go. You can see now I keep on running out of glaze and making up small batches to get the last couple of fritters coated. These were fun to make. You don't need special equipment to make them. You can make them if you have egg allergies in your family. And I think they turned out really well. They would be a great fall treat, especially if you're trying to use up some apples and you're tired of making applesauce and apple pie filling. Could probably use apple pie filling for the apples in this too. I didn't think about that. Just drain the liquid off of them really well. So here you have apple fritters. Thank you so much for joining me. Please hit that like button and comment if you'd like to. I'd appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing to my channel so that I can make it grow bigger and bigger. So make yourself some fritters, and if you don't want to make this many, go to a bakery and buy yourself an apple fritter. Have a good day. Goodbye.